Have a seat on your porcelain throne. It's time to talk some shit on the Powell Movement.
Welcome to the Powell Movement. I'm your host, Mike Powell, and man, life keeps coming at us. Between the pain Ange is suffering through, the sadness and the uncertainty in our worlds, life is really fucking hard right now. I'm one of those people who, when shit goes south, I'm usually like, well, there are other people out there who have it worse than us. But this time around, we are those other people. And it sucks. And while I complain about not having enough hours in the day, that's because something terrible has happened to my wife, and I need to do whatever I can for my family. But my guest this week, well, up until his recent retirement from shooting photos, he chose to be as busy as I am for his whole career. Sven Brunso is a badass. He has more photographs in print than any skier in history. But he's not just an athlete. Sven is one of those rare combinations of work ethic, pro athlete ski chops, and an executive level business mind. So over the years, Sven finds himself shooting on location, and then when it's time to come down and eat, Sven breaks off and does his real job, whether it be with Leki or with Purgatory or whoever he's working for at that point in time. So while Sven chose to make his life harder, the losses that he's experienced in his life are enough to break a man. But not Sven. And his story is so inspiring, especially with all the shit that I'm going through. I think you're really going to like it, but before we chat with Sven, I want to ask you to do a few things for me. First, subscribe wherever you listen. That really does help the show bump up in the algorithm. Second, tell a friend about the show. And if you like it, I know they're going to like it too. And finally, please, please, please support the amazing brands that make this show happen. They are Elan Skis, Outdoor Research, Stanley, and Best Day Brewing. Now, let's talk with Sven Brunso. So, you've been known as the Svenergizer, and you've had a pro model ski of that name at one point. How did you get the pro model ski? And more importantly, how did you get the nickname? And what's the most Svenergizer day you've ever had?
Well, the nickname came from a guy named Herb Manning, who was a pro skier that lived in Telluride. And we were on a trip in 2003 called Tour of the Alps, where we were skiing 42 resorts over the course of about 6 weeks, doing a project for this company called Ski Europe. It was kind of like right when the internet was just starting out and they were trying to push European skiing and bookings. And I had known Herb from Telluride, but we were kind of the ski partners on this trip. And first thing in the morning, as soon as it got light, before the lifts even opened, I wanted to take the photographer out and just hike up and boot up above the hotel and start working. And then I wanted to skip lunch and just eat Cliff Bars. And at the end of the day, everyone else was spent and just wanted to go to the bar. And I still wanted to hike. I just said, I'm going to go until there's no more sun left. I just want to keep doing it over and over. And we sat down to dinner that night, and he's like, I don't know how you do it. He goes, you're like the Energizer Bunny. Actually, he goes, I think you should be called the Svenergizer. That's where the nickname came from. And then a few years after that, I was working with Wagner Skis in Telluride, and they were making a custom ski for me. And then unbeknownst to me, Herb had talked to the owner, Pete Wagner, and said, when you put Sven's custom skis together, you should have it say the Svenergizer. So when I went to pick him up, there was my custom ski. So it wasn't technically a pro model. It was a one of one, I guess, my own personal pro model, but it was the Svenergizer Pro.
There we go. So you're not afraid to work hard, and that's why you are where you are in the world today. And we're going to talk about your work ethic throughout the podcast. But to start out, did your parents work the shit out of you when you were little? Or did you always take the initiative to go the extra mile? Like, looking back at your life, have you been able to pinpoint where that work ethic came from?
Absolutely. My dad was very old school. He was an educator, was a teacher to start with, and then became a counselor. And my mom was a stay-at-home mom when I was really young, and then she went back to working. But we didn't have a big income, and my parents were pretty thrifty, but my dad would always work second jobs. In the summertime, he would work with like the Youth Conservation Corps, do landscaping, and then in the wintertime, he would teach classes at the community college where we lived. So he just showed me that, if you want to get ahead in life, sometimes you just got to work for it. And he was the same one that taught me. I went to apply for my first real job aside from mowing lawns at a Safeway grocery store, and he had me wear a sport coat and a tie. And he said, you don't dress for the job you're applying for, you dress to show them that they should hire you for any job. And so that was really kind of laid the foundation for, how to get ahead. And I was never the most talented at soccer or football or skiing. And he always said the one thing I could do to differentiate myself was outwork everybody. And that just really sunk in. And yeah, so that was taught by my parents, both being really hard workers and diligent and driven. And I picked it up and ran with it.
And when you say soccer and football, I think you played soccer in college. Did you play football in high school as well?
I did. I played football, yeah, I guess through my junior year, and then yeah, played soccer in college. I really got into skiing when I was about 10, but I came to college my freshman year at Fort Lewis College here in Durango, where I live now, and played soccer here. But that's the year that I really got into skiing. I had actually, my advisor had told me for the second semester to do all my classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays so I could ski 5 days a week. And so I played soccer, which was a fall sport. But then I really got into skiing, and then soccer became, something that was more of a hobby than a sport. Skiing, dominated my life. It was my passion.
And it's funny because how you get into skiing is totally different than everybody else. I mean, you grew up in Southern California, everybody's skateboarding and surfing, and you do that stuff too. But everybody would think, oh, maybe you go to Big Bear or Snow Summit or something like that and figure it out. But you go all the way to Indiana and you get a pair of skis from like a cousin for Christmas. And do you get hooked in Indiana on like a golf course?
It was just total serendipity. I never had skis, never had any equipment, and it was Christmas of 1979, and my dad's brother lived in just outside of Indianapolis, and he had in his backyard one of the few hills in Indianapolis. And that year at Christmas, it snowed probably a couple feet leading up to Christmas. And my cousin, who was 5 or 6 years older than I was at the time, he was working in a ski shop and he wanted to get me something for Christmas. And so I'm guessing out of the dumpster, he probably pulled out a pair of skis and boots and poles and put them under the Christmas tree for me. Just happened to all be the right size gear. And I got up on Christmas morning, went out to the back hill. He gave me a few tips, and I probably skied that hill 50 times. And I remember I was so spent at the end of the day that I came in, crawled into bed, still with my jacket and gloves on, and fell asleep, slept right through dinner. But yeah, I was hooked. And then another thing that was serendipitous is we came back to Arizona at that point where we lived. We moved when I was 9 from Huntington Beach, California to Prescott, Arizona. And my dad was teaching a night class at the community college there. And one of the girls in his business class at the start of that semester, he was telling her that he had a son. And she said, well, does your son ski? And he said, well, actually, no, but he just got skis for Christmas and went one day in Indiana and was really hooked. And she said, well, my dad just bought a ski area up in Williams, which is about an hour away from Prescott. And if he wants to come skiing, I'd love to have him be our guest. And so between Christmas 79 and March of 1980, when I went skiing at Williams, I watched the Winter Olympics in Lake Placid. So my only exposure to skiing in motion was watching the Olympics. So when I went skiing for the first time, we couldn't afford a lesson. I'm not even sure the place had instructors, to be honest. And so I took the rope tow up, and then I just went straight down the hill and tried to make parallel turns because that's all I had ever seen. So once I mastered that, my skiing advanced pretty quickly because I skipped the whole process of having to learn how to, French fry and pizza and all that stuff. And so I was totally self-taught. Still to this day, I've never had a lesson, and I probably wish I had because I'm super envious when I see people that grew up ski racing and have that really great fundamental style. I guess I kind of wing it and make it happen. So my exposure to skiing is very rare. And some of my friends growing up in Huntington Beach, whose families had more money, they had condos up in Mammoth or Big Bear, like you said. And so they would invite me to go skiing on the weekends, but I didn't own any gear. I didn't have any idea what I was missing. So I always said no and stayed home and went surfing or rode my skateboard.
So it all happens for you in Arizona. You're like the Rick Kane of skiing. I don't know if you've seen the North Shore.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, totally. So that happens out of Arizona. And then when you think about skiing back then, were you also into the culture? Because if you look at it now, you're the most published skier ever in terms of photography. And were you looking at Powder and Ski Magazine and skiing back then and studying the images and seeing all those angles for the first time just through the magazines?
Yeah, absolutely. I saved up money from my yard work and bagging groceries and so on and bought subscriptions to skiing, and Powder. I would get those delivered, 5 or 6 issues a year, and I would literally go through every single issue kind of cover to cover. I wouldn't even read any of the content. I was just looking at the images and what gear the skiers were using and how they were angulating their turns. And I would just go back, and then the next time I would go skiing, I would almost imagine like, all right, I'm making that turn that I saw on page 7 of that issue of Powder, kind of this smear turn that's happening. And Powder truly became my Bible for the right style of how to ski. You know, that was in the early 80s, and then the skiing was kind of changing going into the late 80s and kind of going into the back then called the extreme skiing movement. Yes, so those magazines, you know, I lived in vicariously. I wanted to travel to, you know, the places that my ski heroes were skiing. And yeah, I read every word, and, you know, there wasn't any place in Prescott to buy the magazine. So I actually just had to subscribe. And I wasn't really exposed to the traditional ski culture that kids that grow up in ski towns have, because I was doing 3 or 4 days a month going to Williams, or maybe on a big outing, I'd go to the Arizona Snow Bowl in Flagstaff, but neither of those places are really rooted in ski culture. So I just had to kind of make up my own fantasy and romanticize what I saw in the magazine. So what was depicted in the magazines became my reality of what the ski world should look like.
So I'm guessing there's a point in life where you realize that you want to live in the mountains. And then when it's time to look for colleges, you're like, shit, I can do Durango, and they've got a college there. I can go to college and I can go to the mountain. Everything's close. Is that like the whole perfect recipe for your future?
Yeah, you know, my dad was the big driver in having me come to Fort Lewis.
Fort Leisure, right?
Fort Leisure, yeah, back then it definitely was. But neither of my parents ever skied, but they were in love with Southwest Colorado. So probably from the time I was 13 until I was, you know, 18, we would spend, you know, Christmas and spring break in Telluride, and then in the summers we come up to Durango and ride the train. And he was a big believer that, you know, small schools are a much better education. And he had actually convinced me to come to Fort Lewis, and they had saved up enough money for me to go 4 years in state in Arizona or 1 year out of state. And he said, if you go to Fort Lewis and you love it, then you should stay, take a year off, get residency, you know, and then put yourself through school for the next 3 years. And so he was really the one, you know, that got me hooked on coming to Fort Lewis. None of my friends from high school in Prescott had even heard of Fort Lewis. They thought I was going into the military. So I came here, and I didn't know anybody. Ended up in a dorm with a roommate that I, you know, had never even spoken to. But that is when it really all came together for me, because in the dorm, I was loaded with kids from Aspen, Steamboat, Denver, because Fort Lewis was the furthest school away from these kids' parents that they could go and still have in-state tuition. So I was now going out and skiing with kids, you know, that were skiing 150 days a year, that had been on skis since they were 3 years old. So I started to go out and wanted to ski as fast as they did. And just, you know, when you're skiing 5 days a week, the learning curve is, you know, is really steep but short. And your improvement when you're skiing with people that are much better than you are is rapid.
It is. But I mean, the thing that really changes everything for you is you go see Blizzard of Aaah there. And that's like the changing of the guard of skiing, given it's probably happened a few years before. But when that movie hits the big screen and you see that at Fort Lewis, like, that movie changes your whole life. It's fair to say, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm not sure I had actually seen skiing in a movie. Just didn't have access to them. And it was my freshman year at Fort Lewis in the fall, probably November, at Noble Hall, one of the auditoriums here. They were showing the Blizzard of Aaah. I saw the poster for it, and I had seen Glen Plake in the magazines. And so there's a picture for the Blizzard of Aaah. And so I recognized Glen Plake. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to go see this ski movie. So it's a sellout theater. I go, and like every other skier of my generation, they walk out of that movie, you know, jaw dropped. And so I walked back across the quad to my dorm room, picked up the payphone, called my dad, and said, Dad, I figured out what I want to do with the rest of my life. He was like, well, what's that? And he said, I want to be a professional skier and chase the endless winter. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and my dad, like me, is a big dreamer, but at this point in his life, he was a guidance counselor, you know. So he said, you should chase the dream. And if you think you're good enough to do it, you should go and see what happens. But get your education first so that you have a plan B and something to fall back on. And if you're really smart, maybe you can connect your passion for skiing with the knowledge you're learning in, you know, business, and make a career out of it. You know, that was the first point when I had actually come to my dad and, you know, said, this is what I want to do. And 90% of kids' parents would have said, well, there's no money in skiing. But my dad was just the opposite. He's like, do it. But, you know, being the realist, he's like, all right, kid coming from Arizona, it's probably not going to work out. And he level set my expectations, but told me to do it. And I remember him saying something to the effect of, don't be the 50-year-old with regrets. Try it now. And if you fail, at least never doubt that you tried.
And the weird thing about that is you get this great response from your dad of like, hey, no, I support you. You definitely follow your dreams. Make sure you get this education. It's great. But you leave Fort Lewis and you go back to Arizona. Is that just because of the in-state tuition? Because I would think the skiing's way better in Colorado and you want to be a pro skier, but now you're moving to Arizona, Rick Caning it again.
Yeah, I was starting to understand myself a little bit, and I truly believe that if I took a year off of school and was just a ski bum and got residency, I may not go back. So in my mind, if I went to school and went far away from skiing, if I went to Tucson, that I would, be able to focus on, getting an education. I wanted to get a degree in marketing and a degree in finance, so I knew I needed to kind of hunker down. And ironically, the 3 years that I was in school in Tucson were fantastic years at Mount Lemmon, which is only about an hour away. So I actually did get quite a bit of skiing. And I was working in a ski shop at the time, and we had free ski privileges at the Arizona Snow Bowl in Flagstaff, which is about 4 hours away. So I would do crazy stuff like get up at 4 a.m, drive 4 hours, ski a full day, and then get in the car and drive back to Tucson. But the great thing about working in the ski shop, which, I started in, I guess, the fall of 1989, was I believe it was in 1990, maybe 1991, I got a pass to go to the SIA show in Las Vegas. And I was super excited because I was, going to get to go see how the industry works, see how the sausage is made, so to speak. And I went there, and this was kind of at the peak of, Glen Plake's status. I really wanted to meet him. And at the time, he was working with Toco Wax. And there was this huge line to get a poster signed by Glen Plake. So I waited in this line to get a poster signed. And I got up there and he's like, what's your name? What do you want on the poster? And I'm like, I don't really care about a poster. I said, our ski club is coming to South Lake Tahoe for spring break. And I want to come skiing with you. I believe that's where you live. And he's like, yeah, okay. So he flips over someone's business card and writes down his phone number and says, yeah, call me when you get there and we'll go skiing. So I walk out of the trade show. My wife picks me up in front of the convention center in Las Vegas. And I said, I got Glen Plake's phone number. And she's like, yeah, I'm sure that's his real number. I said, no, I think it is. Fast forward a couple months. I'm in our van from University of Arizona Ski Club. We pull into the parking lot, South Lake Tahoe. I go to the payphone, dial up the number. Sure enough, Glen answers the phone, asks what I'm doing. I said, oh, hey, we just got here. Everyone's going to the casino or whatever. He's like, well, let's hang out. So he came over and got me, took me back to his house. He was mounting up some skis. We shot the shit for a while. And I'm like, I'm sitting here with my icon. And he made me feel like I was the most important conversation in his world. And then the next day we went skiing. The rest of my ski club went to Heavenly Valley. Plake took me to Kirkwood. And I tried my best to stay on his, ski tails all day long. And I just realized this guy is mortal. He is just an amazing skier, but a gregarious personality, bigger than life persona, but he's just a real guy. And I was on some 190 RD soft coyotes. And he's like, yeah, tomorrow we're going to get you on some bigger skis. So the next day I went from some 190s to some 213s he loaned me, and that changed my world. So yeah, that made me realize that becoming a professional skier, I surely didn't have the skill set, but that it wasn't like being an NBA player, a football player, where you had to have this, amazing amount of God-given brawn or size to be able to do it. He just had skills and he had carved out a niche for himself. And I'm like, I could probably do this. A few years later, we stayed in touch. And when I told him I wanted to get into the business, he actually made some phone calls and helped me get my very first sponsorship deal.
That's so cool, man. He is such a rad guy and does so much for so many people. He's pretty incredible. And he's really the reason why you are where you are today, or another one of the reasons, your work ethic being another reason. But when you think about it, with Plake, when you meet him, you're with the ski club, and the way that you do things, it's like you're the vice president of your ski club in college. Are you always the overachiever, kind of looking to do that extra thing and have that extra bit of responsibility? And does that happen from an early age for you?
Yeah, I was always looking for ways to either be entrepreneurial to make some extra money, or just to, if I ever had free time, in between working on degrees or my job or whatever, I would always, figure out some way to occupy myself, to either try and get smarter and read. Or I remember, since I was trying to get a couple degrees and I did not like Tucson at all, so I decided I was just going to truncate my amount of time there into 3 years. So in order to do that, I had to take 20 plus credits every semester and go to summer school. And so in summer school, there was a lot of kids and fraternities and sororities that probably needed to pick up some summer school credits to graduate or whatever. This is long before computers. I decided to handwrite notes in every class and go Xerox them and print them on red paper because you can't copy red paper in a Xerox machine. And the next day I would sell the notes to fraternity kids that had missed class or wanted to go back and be able to study for tests. And since they couldn't buy one and make copies of it, sometimes I was selling, 15 or 20 copies every day. And I can't remember what I was charging, but it felt like I was, making a lot of money. I just was able to recognize an opportunity and sell something. So in my entire life, I've always done that. I've always been super driven, still probably live up to the Svenergizer name, and it actually scares a lot of people because when I tell someone, hey, let's go for a bike ride or a backcountry ski or whatever, I think they're just a little nervous, that I'm going to run them into the ground. And that's not the way at all. Unless somebody is telling me that they're an amazing skier and they've painted this picture of themselves. And so I'm in the mood to go out and go hard. If someone's like, hey, I'm an intermediate skier, I just want to go out for the day, then I'm in that mindset. And I am surely a type A personality, always have been. And I'm trying to convince myself I can morph into a type B, but it's easier said than done.
Yeah, doesn't sound like there's much chill in the Svenergizer. It's time for my first sponsor break, and I'm going to start things out with Elan Skis. And while I could tell you all about the new award-winning Ripstick ski models or the award-winning Playmaker Twin Tip line, and then push you to demo them at your local shop because they're going to make you have more fun on the mountain, I'm just going to talk about your local shop. There's something special about stepping into your local ski shop. The smell of the freshly waxed skis, discussions about where to find the best skiing, what the shop kids like skiing on best, what they think the best products are, and that expert advice makes these shops more than just a great place to buy gear. Elan believes that ski shops are the soul of skiing, a place where skiers come together for genuine human connection, and that can't be replaced online. And I agree with them. I mean, going to a ski shop is an experience where you connect with a like-minded person who, in a short conversation, understands what you want to do and sets you up with the right gear so you can have as much fun as possible. Shops are among the last authentic pieces of ski community that we have left. So please buy your ski gear from your local ski shop. You can find a list of Elan dealers nationwide over at elanskis.com. My final sponsor this round is Stanley. It's hard to be known for both being that green bottle that kept your grandpa's coffee hot and being the most popular product in pop culture. But that's what Stanley is these days, and that's what you get when you mix in the quality that Stanley has been known for since they pretty much created the category of keeping drinks piping hot and ice cold in 1913. And lately, over 100 years later, that quality, combined with some incredible colorways, partnerships, collaboration, and events, has made Stanley bigger than ever before. And while they're creating some game-changing marketing, working with people like Olivia Rodrigo and Messi, are you kidding me? That's so cool. But what I love is how functional Stanley's products are. I personally use a Stanley pint glass every single day, and I swear by them. And my wife and so many others out there can't live without their Stanley quenchers. I mean, Stanley makes a product for everyone, and now everyone can get Stanley's incredible products in a colorway that totally suits their style, like my new Miami Vice colored pint glasses. I love my Stanley stuff, and I want you to love Stanley too. And I bet you didn't know that Stanley offers Powell Movement listeners their biggest discount that they make available to the public. That's right. I'm going to save you 30% on all of your Stanley products. Here's what you need to do. Go to stanley1913.com, go shopping, and at checkout, enter the code POWELL2025. That's a capital P and then the numbers 2025 with no spaces in there, and you're going to save that 30%. Those are my sponsors. Now let's jump back into the podcast. So you were able to have Glen as a mentor, your dad's a mentor, and it sounds like that you've been a mentor to a lot of people. I was talking to Mattias Giraud, and he mentioned that his career only became as fruitful as it did because when he first started out, before he was anybody, he just moved to the States, and you had took him to your house, and you gave him a 2-hour almost master class on how to be successful as a pro skier. He said you just sat him down and was like, hey, this is what you need to do to send to sponsors. This is how you're going to follow up after a trip. And you gave him all the details, and he kind of used that as a blueprint for his career that's been going on for 21 years. Did you do that for a lot of people, kind of take them in and try to mentor them?
I've had 2 or 3 people that I would say that I have, mentored, pretty seriously. Mattias, he came along when I was probably 10 years into my career. He was an exchange student he lived in Megève, France, and had come to Fort Lewis as an exchange student. And at the time, I was working at Purgatory Resort, and he knew somebody that was on the board of directors for Purgatory, and they just said, hey, there's this kid, kind of a loose cannon, great personality, but, he kind of needs some direction. Can you help him? And so we went out and skied a few times. And I'm like, God, this guy's got a great energy. I just need to help him figure out how to harness it. And so, yeah, I had him come over to the house. And yeah, I don't really know what possessed me. I think I just saw how passionate he was about life, and he kind of almost reminded me of, a young version of Glen Plake, just bigger than life and, articulate and excited. And I'm like, this guy could really be great for the ski industry. And maybe I have something that I can help him with. And yeah, so we kind of sat down, and exactly like you said, I told him that this is how you get started, and you are going to get recognized by sponsors for differentiating yourself, because he's a good skier. But like me, he's not ever the best skier on the mountain, but he is the best personality on the mountain. And he figured out ways just to adapt and change. And as we went from print media to digital media to now creating your own content, he's just been kind of navigating that all beautifully. And, I guess it's nice to know I had some piece of that. But I remember at the time, I just tried to teach him persistence, and how in the industry that was going to get him further along than anything. Differentiate yourself, be super persistent, and you'll always be top of mind with sponsors. When projects become available, maybe they'll land in your lap.
So that's kind of your mentoring and mentoree, but eventually in your life, you graduate college, you move back to Durango, and I'm sure you're doing a bunch of different jobs to make ends meet. But for you to make it as a skier, it sounds like the first way that you were able to get into magazines was you were able to write your way into the magazines first. How did your first powder article assignment thing happen? Was it like a letter to the editor that turned into an article because you went the extra mile?
Yeah, in college, I had written just a quick editorial. Someone had actually written a story, or maybe it was another editorial, saying that Glen Plake shouldn't get coverage in the magazines just because of his rambunctious lifestyle and his hairdo, that he doesn't have the skills to be, showing up in the magazines. And so I had written this editorial when I lived in Tucson, and I had seen the Blizzard of Aaah. I hadn't met Glen yet, but said, hey, based on my research, he was like, an Olympic caliber, elite mogul skier, also a racer. So I think he probably has this amazing background fundamentally in skiing. And so calling him out when you don't know the whole background, is probably a bit naive. When that little editorial got published, and then a few years later, I had pitched a story to Powder. I think they had a section called Little Areas That Rock. And I was living in Durango, but I was skiing at Wolf Creek a lot. And so I had just sent over, basically kind of a one-page query and said, hey, there's this funky ski area. I've got this cool story about how when I was there early season, every time I would come down and ski, there was this guy that had a boombox there, and he must have had one cassette, and it was Patsy Cline. And every time that fall I would ski at Wolf Creek, it was the same cassette. So this Patsy Cline song Crazy seemed to be like the soundtrack of that fall, and they had an abundance of early season snow. And so, I wrote this story for Powder, for Little Areas That Rock. And the travel industry was starting to change. This is the probably mid-90s at this point. And I talked to people that had been around in the ski industry like in the 80s and kind of the halcyon days of ski magazines. And they were saying, hey, when you would go on assignment to the Alps, you would have a model or two, a writer, a journalist, you'd have a budget. You were wined and dined by the tourism offices. That was starting to change. And so now writers weren't getting paid as much. Magazines were surely not giving you fun money to go travel with. And so I did my first big international trip in 94. And then I think in 1999, I went with a photographer named Henry Georgi, and we did a couple months in the Alps. And I reached out to the Swiss Tourism Board to try and get support for the trip. And I said, hey, we have a writer, I'm the athlete, and we have a photographer. And the lady's like, we can support 2 people for your project to go spend a couple weeks in 3 different, ski areas. And I'm like, all right, well, if I want to go as the skier and we need a photographer, someone's got to write. So at that point, I'm like, all right, I've written something. So I sent her something that I'd written for Powder, and then a few other things that had showed up. I think in Snow Country magazine. That was enough for them to say, all right, you can write. And then I reached out to the magazines. I think Freeze at the time, maybe Backcountry or Coular, I think was the big backcountry magazine at the time. And pitched the story ideas. And then I kind of became a writer slash athlete, and figured out that that was my way to kind of make myself, a little more relevant and indisposable.
And the way that you do things, you said that you found opportunities, but it's not like you find opportunities, you create them. And it's like you mentioned Henry Georgie. And the way that you get to shoot with Henry Georgie is, I don't want to say you stalked him, but did you pretty much call him out of the blue?
I stalked him.
Okay. Yeah, so you stalk this photographer and you make it happen, right?
Yeah. When I first started subscribing to the magazines, and I was getting the magazines like mid-'80s and on, Henry Georgie was the guy. He was the photographer on a lot of the covers, and you couldn't flip more than 2 or 3 pages in any of those magazines without seeing, Henry Georgie's name. So I knew he was the guy. And I figured that if I wanted to try and be the best, I needed to work with the best. So I remember reaching out to Dave Reddick, who was the photo editor at Powder at the time, and asked him if he could give me Henry Georgie's phone number, which he was kind enough to give me. And I asked Dave for some advice on, like, how do I pitch myself that I'm trying to get into the business? He's like, just call him and ask. The worst he can say is, no, I don't want to shoot you. So I reached out to Henry Georgie, and this was in January, and he lived in Fernie, British Columbia at the time, and I was in Durango, and I said, hey, I'm an aspiring athlete. I would love to shoot with you. I'll pay my own way. Can I get in on one of your photo shoots? And he's like, well, how soon can you be here? I said, when do you need me? And this was a Tuesday, I think. And he goes, a storm's coming in Thursday. And I'm like, I'll be there. And at the time I was managing a restaurant in Durango, and I got done with my shift one night, got in the car, drove straight through to Fernie, pulled into his driveway as he was packing up his minivan. And Fernie at that point was like legendary because it had been in one of the Matchstick production movies. And so I was so excited to ski Fernie. And like, we're loading stuff into the van. I'm like, oh, maybe we're not going to Fernie. And he's like, oh, we're going to go to this little ski area called Whitetooth. And I said, okay, I've never heard of it, but whatever. We drive for 3 hours, get to this little ski area called Whitetooth. I have never in my life been on a pair of skins. So I have these bindings at the time. I think they were maybe Securafix or early versions of Alpine Trekkers. I'm full on rookie. I'm trying to peel the paper off my skins, get them on my skis or whatever.
Because now you're a beast in the backcountry, but back then you're a total rookie.
I was not a beast. I had a lot of endurance, but very little skill.
No, I'm saying now you're a beast in the backcountry.
Now I'm a beast, yeah.
But back then you had no idea what you were doing.
Not at all. I was a total newbie. So there was only one other skier along for the trip. So Henry and the other skier, they're long gone. We take the bottom chairlift, this double chairlift up at Whitetooth, and then they're off on the skin track. So I'm in a pair of like race boots, because that's what they used to send free skiers back then. So uncomfortable boots. I've never been, and if you ever used Alpine Trekkers or Securafix, they have this really weird fulcrum point, so it puts you really high. So doing kick turns and things is really challenging. So it is socked in. We're like inside the milk jug. And I catch up to Henry, and he's like, hey, we're going to keep skinning. We're going to bust out of the clouds. And I think it's going to be really spectacular. I'm in Colorado. We don't get inversions here. I'm like, what is this guy talking about? We're never going to get out of the clouds, but I just better shut my mouth and keep plodding away. So I did. Sure enough, another hour or so, we bust out of the clouds, skin to the top of this peak. This other skier who had worked with Henry gets the first shot because he was a known commodity. So the other skier goes. There's a very specific shot that Henry has because there's all these peaks, the Purcells and the Selkirks sticking out of this cloud deck. And there's this perfect mantle of sparkly snow. The other skier goes, blows the turn. Can't remember if he was in the wrong spot or his form was off. And in shooting stills, everything has to be perfect. You can get away with being loose and sloppy in video, but in stills, everything is like highly amplified. And so Henry's like, hey, I'm going to give you a chance to rebait. So he went up, went again, blew the second turn. So I was like, Sven, you're up. And the very first shot he gave me was this small rock drop, I don't know, 8-10 feet at the most, but this amazing backdrop. I hit it, do the really clean Scott Schmidt air, nice and tight, skis across up, stick the landing, and he just moves down the hill a little bit. And he's like, all right, let's just keep working down the hill. I probably do 8 or 10 setups working our way down the hill. We skin back up. The other skiers kind of off just free skiing. He's bummed out. He kind of blew his opportunity. So Henry and I are just working one-on-one. And not only were those photos like some of the best of my career, but what we were skiing ended up becoming Kicking Horse ski area. And so all of those photos, which were taken in 1997, as Kicking Horse was starting, so for the first 2 years, the Kicking Horse existed. All of those photos were used to promote Kicking Horse. So Powder, Outside, a bunch of these European magazines were using all those images, and that one shot, the very first shot I ever took with Henry Georgie going off that rock with the skis crossed up, that one shot ended up being 10 covers. And that day alone generated more than 25 covers around the world. First day I'd ever worked with Henry, and still my most prolific day ever on snow.
That is insane. It's your first day ever shooting, and you say it's one of your best days ever shooting. Not your first day ever shooting, but your first day shooting with Henry. You got some of the best images you've ever shot with. You got 25 covers around the world. How many images do you think that parlays into, or how many pages do you think that turns into in magazines?
Oh, all said, that single day of shooting, which probably was no more than a half a day, parlayed into more than 100 published images around the world in magazines. And if you take everything from trail maps and tourism guides and newspaper articles, hundreds. It was just one of those magical days. I think I was so excited. I was kind of coming into my own, learning how to ski for the camera. Henry at that time was amazingly energetic. Keep in mind, this is when you're shooting slide film. So nowadays you can actually take the picture and look at it and be high-fiving the athlete and the photographer, are super into it because you can actually see the results. Back then you were having to wait a couple weeks to see stuff. So we really had no idea what we were getting in the can, but he was super excited, and that was just, getting me totally motivated to hike faster and do more. And the sweet thing about that day was that the other skier, because he was a little bit frustrated that he'd kind of blown the couple shots, gave me the opportunity to work one-on-one with Henry, whereas if the other skier had nailed the first turn, who knows if I would have even gotten a shot, or I surely wouldn't have gotten that signature shot off the rock at the top. So that was just one of those things that, I've had some really good luck along the way. Going back a little bit to that story about the little piece that I wrote in Powder about Glen Plake, I was going to school at U of A at the time, so I put Sven Brunso, Tucson, Arizona. And a couple months later, I got a phone call from a photographer named Mike Padian, who lived in Phoenix. And he called me and said, "Hey, I'm trying to get into shooting ski photography. I've shot some snowboard photography, but I'd like to get into shooting some ski photography. Would you be willing to help me, build a portfolio?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, if you're willing to come down here." And so we shot Mount Lemmon, Arizona Snow Bowl. So for the 3 years I was in Tucson, I was actually working with this photographer who wasn't afraid to spend money experimenting on shooting slide film and to do something a little different than what the other photographers were. So because of that little piece I wrote, I met him. And because of working with him, I had enough imagery to get some sponsors, and then I had some money from sponsors, and then that helped fund the trip to go work with Henry. And if had Henry truly been the first time I'd ever worked for the camera, I surely would have blown it, because I would have never realized early on in my career that when someone says, "Hey, you need to be 10 feet out and 10 feet down," that they mean 10 feet out and 10 feet down. You can't be 15 feet over. Especially back in the day of manual focusing on photos, the shot was basically the window, especially if you're shooting with the long lens. Sometimes your depth of field was a foot, or 2 feet. So if you blew the spot, the shot was gone.
Thinking about your knowledge of photography as well, you're a college student. Did you ever take any photography classes knowing that was going to kind of be your future in skiing?
Ironically, I took 2 photography classes, one in high school, which I got a C in, and then I graduated college with a 3.95. My only C grade in college was in photography.
Huh.
In a 4-year career with 2 degrees. I was so interested in showing off my photography or doing the things I wanted to do. I never really took the time at that point to learn the art of photography, to learn how exposure worked and shutter speed compared with aperture and shooting on black and white film and how to get the subject in your photo and the rule of thirds. And I learned all that stuff later. I was self-taught and kind of taught myself how to shoot proper classical photography. But in high school and college, I was too immature, and I just wanted to go out and shoot cool photos. And my mom still to this day gives me a hard time about that, when I still get photos published here and there that I took about how those are my 2 worst grades in my academic career were in photography.
It's pretty funny. So you've got sponsors, and you're a full-on pro at this point. You're having photos published all over the world. You're on covers. Is there a moment where you call home and you're like, "Dad, holy shit, all that stuff we talked about, it's happening"? Do you remember that moment?
My dad died in 1995. Fortunately, before he died, I remembered Purgatory had made a poster of me skiing some powder at Purgatory. And I was able to sign a poster from my dad saying, thanks for telling me to chase the dream, and supporting me every step along the way. And he had that framed and put in his office. And that was like kind of when my career was just starting to move forward, but he kind of passed away before it really took off. But from that photo shoot in Whitetooth with Henry Georgie, we kind of created this prolific partnership where we were traveling around a lot. I mean, he was coming, instead of me driving to Fernie to be able to shoot with him, I was starting to do more and more photo shoots. He's like, hey, I want time with you. Can I come to Durango and shoot you? And so he came down in 1998 and shot here in the fall. And we had really good early season snow. Maybe it was like November. And then that spring, he came back in May. We would shoot spring skiing in the morning, climb peaks and ski couloirs and shoot when the light was really good. And in the afternoon, we'd change gears and shoot mountain biking here in Durango. And so all this stuff kind of came together where I want to say it was the fall of 1999. I walked into a newsstand and I was on the cover of Bike Magazine, shot that Henry had taken, cover of Powder Magazine. It was the 2000 Buyer's Guide, shot from Red Mountain Pass that Henry took in that fall. And then on the cover of Men's Journal, a shot that was taken, at our day at what became Kicking Horse. So when I walked into the newsstand, I had 3 covers, 2 ski magazines and a bike magazine. And to my knowledge, 2 things struck me about the Men's Journal cover. One was that I had never seen a skier on the cover, and that was when Alex Lowe had died. So I'm on the cover skiing, and it actually said on the cover, pro skier Sven Brunso at 8,000 feet above Whitetooth ski area, and then in the corner, it was like a tribute to Alex Lowe. And I knew who he was, and I'm like, well, God, that is weird. Why isn't Alex Lowe on the cover of this magazine instead of, some chump from Colorado that's out skiing powder? And for me, that was like a big moment. And that was the last Men's Journal cover, I believe, that ever featured a non-celebrity. Now they just do headshots of celebrities. So that was a pretty big moment. I remember I had gotten the media kits from all of the magazines. So I had a media kit from Men's Journal, and I knew what people paid for a full-page ad in Men's Journal, which at that time was a lot of money. And so I was able to go to my sponsors, and I think in that same issue of Men's Journal, I had a 2-page spread that Henry had taken from spring skiing here. So I went back to my sponsors, Fisher, Oakley, Cliff Bar, Leki at the time, Osprey, and I said, hey, here's what it would cost you to buy a full-page ad in this issue of Men's Journal. I have a 2-page spread and the cover, which is not up for sale. So here's what I figure that visibility is, the exposure is worth to you. And so being able to do that with, Bike Magazine, I wasn't ever a great biker. I just happened to, be able to ride good enough to get a cool picture. But, with the cover of Powder and the shot on the cover of Men's Journal, that was when I really kind of figured, all right, I'm using my business sense to actually turn this into something. And I sent a spreadsheet that I had sent to the people saying, hey, here's kind of what this is worth. And I remember a couple of weeks later, I got this care package from Oakley with a letter from the director of sports marketing, and it was this like titanium watch and a couple things. It's like really nice handwritten letter signed by the whole sports marketing department, and I'm like, all right, I've kind of arrived. My work is being recognized, and my value to these brands is, starting to escalate. And, my dad, one of the things he had taught me, he was still around when I had landed all of these initial 4 sponsors that I had. And he said, remember that these 4 companies are taking a chance on you and you've done nothing for them. You have not provided any worth for these companies, and they believe enough in you to support you. Don't ever leave these 4 companies as long as you're in this business. And I remember specifically Fisher Skis. The first year I was sponsored by Fisher was 1992, fall of 1992. They sent me skis. At the time, they distributed Reichley boots and Look binding, so I got the whole setup. And the very first day I skied that fall, I went to Snowbird. I blew my knee out. Oh. So I'd done nothing for Fisher. Not one thing. And my dad said, pick up the phone, call them, be open and honest and transparent and tell them what happened and say, thanks for taking a chance on me. I'm happy to pay for the gear or whatever. And I remember I called Fisher in Europe. I got in touch with them, called, and they're like, injuries happen. We're happy to support you again next year. This gear that we sent you will become your backup gear. We'll send you all the newest stuff next year. Best of luck on your healing journey, and we'll talk soon. And so I'm now retired a few months ago, but to this day, Osprey, Leki, Oakley, Fisher, been my sponsors for the entire 32-year ride.
It's time for my second round of sponsors, and this time I'm starting out with Outdoor Research. I've been using OR products since I moved to Seattle almost 25 years ago because they outperform everything on the market. I mean, they build products to perform in the miserable weather that the Pacific Northwest can be known for. And when you live here, you need to have best-in-class gear, and that's what OR has always delivered. From building industry-leading gear for mountaineers, which are still best in class, to the mittens that every snowboarder wore in the 90s, which are making a comeback in a big way, to the new styles, cuts, fits, and kits that they've developed with the help of their incredible athlete roster that includes world champion Troy Podmilsack, freeski legend Mark Abma, and X Games gold medalist Zoe Atkin, just to name a few. While OR has always been building the best products to outperform everything else in brutal wet weather, the recent focus on style is what has not only me, but my kid and his friends all wanting to wear OR gear. Because now, it looks as good as it performs, and that's a bold statement. But don't take it from me. Head on over to outdoorresearch.com, check out the products, buy yourself something, and stay drier and warmer than ever before. My final sponsor is Best Day Brewing. And if you haven't heard of Best Day, they are hands down the best tasting NA beer on the market. I enjoy Best Day for so many reasons. The flavor is the most important. I swear by the hazy IPA, the Kolsch, and the Electro Lime. The beauty of Best Day is that it really tastes as good or better than an alcoholic beer. I mean, in a blind taste test, if I put an Electro Lime against any Mexican beer, 9 out of 10 times, my friends are going to pick the Electro Lime because they like it better. And you can drink a few of them at the bar or in the parking lot after skiing, and you don't have to worry about driving or making bad decisions. Really, I haven't quit drinking. When I go to the bar to have beers, I always mix in a few Best Days with the leaded stuff, so I can be more functional throughout the night, and an added benefit that I didn't expect was it makes me last twice as long. I mean, I can stay till closing time. I don't know what you were thinking, but if you want to have your best day or night ever, or just want to enjoy a few cold ones anywhere, grab a Best Day and you can forget about the calories, forget about the alcohol, and forget about getting in trouble on the way home. To see all the flavors and order some beer, head on over to bestday.com, and if you're flying on Alaska, you can enjoy a Best Day Kolsch at 30,000 feet. Those are my sponsors. Now let's jump back into the podcast. You keep referring to your dad, and when he passed, I mean, that had to be crushing for you because all these life lessons that you got, just pieces of wisdom that he just tells you, and then 25 years later, you're like, man, that piece of wisdom saved me a few years of trying to figure it out just because he knew what was going on. How crushing was it for you? I mean, obviously, it's crushing when you lose somebody. Were you lost for a while after that?
Yeah, my dad, I was an only child. When we lived in Prescott, there wasn't a lot of, kids around. And, my dad was, definitely my best friend. We did everything together. And there was never a single day in my life that I did not talk to my dad. I remember even the first year I went to Chamonix to spend some significant amount of time over there. And I was explaining to my dad, like, hey, I'll call from the payphone once a week and check in or whatever, because it's like $2 or $3 a minute. And every night I remember going back to our hotel and, they'd be, Monsieur Brunso, your father called and would like you to call him back just to check in. It'd be a 30-second phone call, but I'd go and put my Franks in the phone and call my dad and check in. So to have somebody that is that present in your life and is kind of, your guiding force, both my parents were, incredibly impactful. They had an amazing marriage, so supportive of each other. So just this like foundation of like kind of a perfect upbringing. And then you just had that, yanked out from under you. They had been here in Durango seeing my fiance at the time, and we were a couple of weeks away from getting married, and they'd come up to kind of finalize wedding plans, and they were on their way driving back to Prescott, and we were in a car accident, hit head on the Indian reservation, killed my dad instantly. And yeah, my mom ended up, breaking 30 bones, and she's had, 35 surgeries since then, and it was devastating. I guess the only silver lining is my last memory of my dad is he and I playing Nerf football in the parking lot of my apartment before they got in the car to leave. And I remember my dad that morning, they were running late, which was always the case with my dad. And he had gotten into their car to leave. And then I was up on the patio waving goodbye to him. And he said, hey, let's throw a few. So he got back out of the car. My mom was still in the car, and we threw the Nerf around for 5 minutes or whatever. And he gave me a big hug and said he loved me. And I walked back up to the kitchen, and there was a note from my dad saying, looking forward to the big day. I'm glad you met your future wife. She's amazing and so happy with where you're going in your life. And I'm so proud of you as a son. And then 4 hours later, he's gone.
Man, that is so heavy. And then you're the only child, so you have to pick up all the pieces and your mom's injured. I can imagine that being just like such a heavy time in your life. I'd say the heaviest time in your life, but it's not. In your career, I mean, I'm very sorry about your loss, but I'm going to jump back into your career. And it goes from you are an athlete getting photos all over the world, shooting with Henry and other people. But then you're also like a businessman. While you did like 10 years doing different jobs, odds and ends, it starts with like Bula. And I think in 98 or something, you start working with them. And were you riding the crazy headwear trend of the late 90s and just printing money with that shit?
Bula was a Durango company. I think there was three guys that founded Bula, and had gone to Fort Lewis. And I think a couple of them had been exchange students in New Zealand, which is where they got the name. And they started making headbands in their garage, out of fabric and a little bit of fleece. And so, yeah, it started to take off. And then I moved back to Durango in 92. And then in 1994, in the Lillehammer Olympics, Bula was the headwear sponsor of the U.S. ski team. And that was the year that Tommy Moe and Peekaboo Street, it was a big year for like the U.S. Alpine team. And so they're all over the place with these like cow print headbands and hats and berets. And so Bula was getting big. They were one of my sponsors. And so I just remember going out to the guy that owned Bula and said, "Hey, do you have anyone doing sports marketing?" And he's like, "No, we're a pretty small company. We don't really have any budget." And I said, "Well, how about if I come in and just kind of do an internship and help out getting product out to the ski areas for photo shoots and athletes?" And yes, they kind of brought me on in a non-paid role, and that quickly morphed into a paid role. And I kind of became the director of sports marketing for Bula. But at the same time, I was the general manager of a restaurant. So I would get done working at the restaurant, shut it down at 11 o'clock at night, and then drive out to the industrial park here in town where Bula was, plug in and start working and box up promotional boxes and have them all loaded up, ready for the guys and shipping the next morning. And it was like I was never even there. It was like stealth, Sven in and out under the cover of darkness. And yeah, so I have never made enough money from skiing. I could have surely been a ski bum and supported myself living in a 2-bedroom with, 4 other guys, but I never would have made enough money to support a family or, build a house and live in an expensive place like Durango. So I've always, had multiple jobs. This is the first time now in my life that I really only have one job. And so Bula was, my big play with Bula was going into the 1998 Olympics, which was Nagano, Jonny Moseley with the, leopard skin Flintstones looking hat. And so, we were golden. That there was a period there where we couldn't make stuff nearly as fast as we were selling it, and everybody wanted a piece of Bula. And it was an exciting time because I had kind of seen where it started and the ramp up and all the work it took behind the scenes, and the stuff was pretty far out there. And so that one moment with Jonny Moseley doing the 360 mute grab with that hat on was on the page of every newspaper and probably Sports Illustrated. And that one image probably did as much for Bula as every other piece of marketing that they ever paid for.
So it like not only changed the sport of skiing, but it changed the brand right there.
Absolutely.
And so from Bula, it looks like you go headfirst back into the restaurant industry for like a decade, but then you transition to the vice president of marketing at Purgatory. And that sounds like the best job in Durango, like, period. How did you end up with that one?
Another one of those serendipitous moments. The guy that was the vice president of the ski area used to come into the restaurant called the Red Snapper that I managed. And so I had kind of built a relationship with him. And through knowing some people that worked at the ski area, because, it's a pretty small town, I recognized probably 10 things that they could hire a part-time person to do, but didn't justify a full-time job. So I actually put together this portfolio, and each job that I could do, there was a page, like a description, bullets, how many hours a week it would do, and how I could kind of justify it, where I could say, this is what I think my ROI would be. And so I went up and did a presentation to the guy up at the mountain, and he looked at it and said, "Well, we obviously don't have a job that's 10 different jobs." He said, "But I want to hire you. I like your style. I don't have anything right now, but, let's see what happens." And about a week later, he called and said, "Hey, the guy that is the sales manager for Texas just gave us notice. Do you want to step in and be the sales manager for Texas?" And I said, that sounds fantastic. So that was like in October. And by the next spring, they had made me the director of sales. And a year later, they phased out their current marketing director and made me vice president of sales and marketing. And that all happened in a a very quick time. And I think it was just because I was willing to show them that I wasn't afraid to work, 60, 70, probably honestly 80 hours a week at times. And I surely wasn't the smartest person in the company in sales or marketing. I just outworked everybody.
Were you able to still shoot photos? I mean, is it something where you're planning all spring and summer for the winter, and then in the winter you're traveling, shooting photos, and then working all night once you're done skiing?
It was an interesting time. At that point, we were really very focused on winter business, and marketing in the ski business for a ski resort really takes place, May through November. Back at that point, that was kind of pre-internet, or the internet was just starting. You would still go do all these in-person ski shows, Ski Dazzle in LA, and go to Chicago, and that's when you really put in all the work. You bought the ads in the magazines, you worked with the tour operators. So I busted ass in the fall. And then once it got to winter, you were tweaking some things based on we have a contingency because we don't have very good snow. So we need to do something aggressive here in terms of pricing. But I was able to go ski, and I had kind of earned a lot of respect from my peers there at the mountain. And they're like, as long as you're getting your work done, if you're in Japan and you can plug in after working and get your work done and things aren't falling through the cracks, then we support you going out and doing stuff. So I was shooting a lot here in the San Juans at the time. I was really getting into backcountry skiing. So when conditions were safe, we'd go into the backcountry. And at that point, I had developed enough of a reputation with photographers that they knew it was worth coming to me to shoot, that it would be worth their while. And my formula became very different from the famous photographers at that time, which were, the Lee Cohens and the Scott Markowitzes. They would go out and shoot with 4 or 5, sometimes 6 people, at Alta and Snowbird. And, so they're just banging out like so much content because they have all these fantastic skiers and they're just like amazing. I really liked going out with the photographer. And for me, the sweet spot was one-on-one or maybe 2 athletes and 1 photographer. In the backcountry, from a safety standpoint, 3 is a little better. So I was able to take those 13 years when I was working at Purgatory. It was kind of the prime of my ski career in terms of my fitness and my ability to ski well for the camera. And so, yeah, I was, going to Europe for, a couple weeks here, a couple weeks in the spring. I'd go down to South America for a couple weeks in the summer. And all the time I was taking off from work, ended up being my vacation time. We didn't really have comp time. So if I was down there, if I was in Portillo shooting for 2 weeks, maybe for 4 or 5 days, I wouldn't plug in and work. But the rest of the time, at the end of the day, when the photographer was, going to the bar for a pisco sour and to soak in the hot springs, I was plugging in with their dial-up internet, returning emails and creating initiatives and marketing campaigns for the ski area.
That's been your deal like with Leki as well, because your next great job is Leki, and you've been with them for a long time. We're not going to really talk about working with them. But with them, too, it's like on all these trips that you go on, especially when you get behind the scenes, some of these trips, you're actually planning all the details of the trip. Then you're doing the beta behind the scenes of like figuring out exactly what's going to happen when you're out there on snow. So you're putting in like the extra effort that nobody does. Like I talked to Liam, who you've shot a shit ton with, and he's like, yeah, we can go to a zone. And I'll be like, we need to get there between 10 and noon, and we're going to have a good window of light. And you'll look at them and you'll be like, no, we need to be there at 10:14 a.m. And if we're there, we're going to nail the shot. And that's kind of the shit that you put into a photo shoot to make sure that you're always maximizing your time out in the field. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I have never felt like I was the strongest skier out there. So what I bring to the equation is something a little bit different. And if I know there's a big storm coming Saturday, I'll call Liam and say, hey, if the storm is materializing, can you be here Saturday to shoot? And he'll be like, yeah, I can come down. So on Friday, I'll go out, I'll put the skin track in, and then I'll sit there and I'll watch the light, and I might sit in a zone from 8 in the morning until noon, and I'll say, all right, the sweet window for this window right here is between 10:10 and 10:40. That's when you got the right side angle. The snow can be backlit. And I'll just look at my watch and be like, all right, the perfect moment is like 10:14, 10:15, because the shadow moves off this rock face. And that's when we want to be there dropping in. So we'll be out there skinning, and it might be like 9 o'clock. And I know it's going to take us an hour and a half. And I'm like, hey, we really got to pick up the pace here. And Liam might be like, well, we'll get there when we get there. I'm like, no, it's really critical that I'm on top, ready to drop in by 10:12. So when the light moves, and that's always blown photographers' mind. they're carrying a 40, 50-pound pack. So if I put a skin track in the day before and it sets up overnight, their job is easier. So if I get them in the right spot with the perfect snow, when the light is right, and I've made their trip up the mountain more efficient, why are they not going to want to come back and shoot with me? That's my hope. And then another thing I do to differentiate myself is I don't wait for photographers to send stuff out to the magazines or to my sponsors. A lot of big photographers will wait till the end of the year, like this time of year when they have some time, and they'll start sending out stuff to sponsors saying, "Hey, here's all the stuff I shot of your athletes during the year." And I'm like, no, why wait? So I would actually, after every great photo shoot with Liam, I'd say, hey, I want to sit down on the computer and make 10 to 12 selects of the nuggets, the gems that we got on this last shoot. And then I am going to send these off to the photo editors, Mike Lorenz at Backcountry Magazine, to some of my sponsors, and to say, hey, here, just so you know, this is what we got this last weekend. If you see something here you like, we will give you first right of refusal. Just tell us which frame it is, which image you like. And so much of the stuff, we'd get the magazines in March or April to say, I love that, I want to run it next year, hold it for me. Instead of Backcountry Magazine might get 20 or 30,000 shots in the summer to consider for the next year. But if they've already committed to 2 shots that Liam and I took because we sent it to them when we're in the ether and we're super excited about it, sure, it takes more work to sit down after a 4-day photo shoot and cull through those photos and clean a couple of them up and send them off. But I'd say 90% of the stuff that I've gotten published in the last decade has been because either Liam or myself posted it on social media, tagged a magazine we would like to get it to show up in, or reached out to a sponsor. And a sponsor picks it up. And, that's how us as a unit have kind of, really set out to make a niche for ourselves.
Well, when you think about yourself and you being an alpha and you going out there and finding all the beta the day before, and then you're out there setting the skin track and doing everything to make it easier for everybody else to accomplish your and their objective. But you know exactly what you want to do. You're like, hey, I've got these 9 places in this zone that we want to go to, and we're going to tick all of these off. I don't care if Liam gets tired because we are going to hit all of these things in time. So I could think that might be a little frustrating if you're overworking somebody. But then you're also a dude who's a photographer who's got covers and all this shit himself, who knows exactly what he's doing. So you're directing the photo shoot as well. I'm sure half the time you're out there, a photographer will be like, no, we need you here. And you'll be like, actually, if you're here and I'm here, we're going to get the shot better. And maybe a lot of times you're right. But does that ever annoy photographers?
Oh, it bugs the shit out of them. I'm sure I am a complete annoyance. I tell people that I am a pain in the ass to work with. Everyone I've shot with would probably agree, and photo editors would surely second that. But that's how I work. I guess I have some legitimacy when I'm working with another photographer talking about how I see something, because I myself have shot stuff that's been published that they've seen. But some photographers I've worked with, they're directing the shoot. It's like, this is where you're going to be. You're going to come in here. This is where you're going to start. You're going to have this amount of horsepower. You're going to make your turn. Apex of the action is here. Here's where you're going to finish. And in my mind, I'm like, a great photo takes a great photographer and a skier that's in the right place at the right time. So it takes both people. So there should be a say, from both sides. So I don't want to say that I direct. Liam might disagree, but I don't want to say that I'm the director of the shoot. But Liam is not one of those people Liam's a great photographer. And ever since the first day we shot together, he's been like, what do you see? How can you ski this in the way that is most exciting to you? And then I'll capture it, because really the essence of the power of the turn, harnessing all the energy and like making the snow fly and really angulating, the skier has to know where that's most likely to happen, and, where they can articulate the photo best. And then a great photographer can say, all right, that's where you want to be. How can I make the best photo? And that's where Liam and I are really good. Sometimes he'll see something that I don't see at all, and he'll say, hey, I see if you come in here. And I'm like, I don't see that, but explain it to me. And he's usually right. If he sees something, I maybe didn't even consider it. And other times, if I'm ahead of him on the skin track, I'll come into a zone and I'm like, here's where I want to make the first turn. This is the second setup we're going to do over here. And by the time he gets there, I've actually drawn in the snow with my, pole, stand here and radio me. And so he'll call. He's like, yeah, what do you want? I'm like, oh, hey, I'm at the top. I'm already ready to go. I'm going to come down. And if you're looking up here, you see that big tree. About now the snow should make a starburst on the top, and I'm going to come in and arc the turn. My main turn's going to be here. And normally I couldn't ask a photographer to do that, but Liam and I have shot for 10 years together, and it's been so fruitful. I think he just kind of lets me go, and it's probably easier just to accept my nuances and how driven I am, and we still get great stuff. And I've never seen Liam out with other photographers when I'm not on the shoot. So I imagine maybe Liam's like, hey, here's what I see, and this is how we're going to do it. And everyone just follows along. And that's just never been my style. And I had this 10-year relationship with Henry Georgie that was very prolific. And then that kind of morphed into the shooting with Liam. And we've been doing this for 10 years, and we're great friends. And that's probably why we can have kind of this relationship where we kind of push each other and, give each other shit in a hard time. And we really have fun. And it's really important for me to be out there with one of my best friends, because there's a ton of travel, and this can be a really stressful business. You rarely show up at a ski area with 2 feet of new snow and blue skies. Sometimes you get someplace for 5 days and the weather sucks and the snow sucks. And that's really when you find out if the artist is a master of their craft, if a skier can ski really shitty snow and a photographer can make it look good. That's when you feel like you're accomplishing something. And Liam and I are able to do that and kind of defy the odds and still make the magic happen when we need to.
In terms of the photos that you guys have produced, whether it's you and Liam or you and Henry or any of that, when you think of like the cover or the photo that you're just most proud of, what's that?
Well, I think the men's journal cover was one of my favorite photos just because of the moment in time, being the first time I was ever on skins and going up through the inversion and thinking it was never going to get sunny, and just all the things that fell into place, and that was such a mainstream magazine. That was really cool. If people ask me to kind of narrow down what my 4 or 5 favorite photos are in time, I have one that stands out, and it was a photo I took with Liam in a place called Adelboden, Switzerland, and it was a spot that we had seen in the morning that was all in the shade. And Adelboden's a massive ski area, and that was one of those times we had shown up with about 2 feet of new snow, and it went blue. I think our first day there, we skied in a nuclear storm. The next day it cleared up, and we saw this amazing face with this huge backdrop, but it's totally in the shade. And it's the first day we'd been there with good weather. And our guide said, oh, hey, we're going to drop off the backside here and ski into another village and spend the day over there. And at the end of the day, we're going to come back and finish here. And so I remember we did this big loop, came back around, looked at that spot, and it was just starting to get sun on it. And Liam and I kind of talked about it and asked the guide if we could just hang out for 30 minutes after the lift closed to ski this line. And he's like, I don't know if the sun's going to like really do what you think it's going to do. And I'm like, well, I'm kind of watching it, and it's starting to creep that way. And I think if I start hiking now, I can be up there, and there's going to be one turn, probably the second turn, that's in the sunlight. And I said, that's it. And it was a big consequential line. It was probably like a couple thousand vertical feet. And it was one of those lines that had the potential to avalanche. It was kind of this big hanging snow field, a little bit of convexity at the top. So I got up there, dug a snow pit, felt really good with it. But I told Liam, I'm like, all right, when I go, I got to go the whole way. I got to ski the whole thing. And we waited. And like the perfect spot where we thought the sun was going to go, it turned on, and it was in the right spot for no more than 90 seconds. I dropped in, made my first turn, got set up, made my second turn, and it was one of my cleanest powder turns ever. If I did it 100 times, I couldn't have hit it any better. And I skied that entire line, which was probably 50 or 60 turns. And so it was one of the best runs of my life, one of my favorite photos. And then the highlight of it all was the second that we'd taken that, Liam hiked up, and then he skied the same line. I kind of spooned my tracks, and then we had to skin out of this valley to get back into the village. But being with one of my best friends, watching the sun move across the slope during this day. So it's one of my favorite photos, and it's been a couple covers, a couple 2-page spreads and magazines, but just one of those moments in time frozen where you're like, it couldn't have been any more perfect, and just kind of like, the perfect capture of where I was in my career. And I kind of look back at that, and I can remember how that day felt, breathing in the cold air and the excitement and the anticipation. And yeah, so it's all captured, this moment frozen in time. That's perfect.
When you think about it, with what you do, I mean, you're constantly traveling. You have 2 kids, a wife, and you're always on the road. Was that a tough thing? Just like missing a lot of childhood to kind of pursue your dreams of being always busy in the ski industry and, never having a minute to rest?
It was challenging. At the time when I was making, a little bit of money skiing, we were trying to get ahead. My wife and I were both working, multiple jobs here, and we had young kids at the time. So, when they were like 1 and 3, leaving wasn't as hard. My wife was a big believer that if I was out and traveling and following my passion and living my dream, that when I came home, I would be more present, hopefully be more patient, be a better father. And she thought it was important that I showed my kids that, what it's like to chase your dream, so they could actually, see somebody doing that in the flesh. As my kids got older, I remember the first time I went on a trip, I was going for about a month, and my kids may have been 4 or 6. And I remember my son was like, he was 6 at the time, and I was walking out on the tarmac at the airport in Durango, and he was like, hanging on my leg and wouldn't let go. And he's like, please, can you take me? Can you put me in your bag? And that was the first time I realized it was actually impactful that I was leaving. And so then it got pretty hard because the kids were kind of at that sweet age for, 5 or 6 years where it was really hard to pick up and leave. But I think, a combination of having a wife who really believed in me and wanted me to be true to myself and follow my passion, along with kids as they started to get, a little bit older, they actually thought it was kind of cool that their dad was a pro skier. They'd have me come into career day and sign posters for other classmates. And so, maybe they were happy to push me out the door because they thought what I was doing was, kind of cool.
That is pretty rad. It's pretty cool to have your kids stoked on you and want you to come in for Parents' Day and sign posters, which is, my kid would never want me to come into a school. That is what it is. But here's where your story kind of gets flipped upside down. So it's like 10 years ago. It's 2016-ish is when we're going to say. But mental health wasn't really being talked about a lot back then. A lot of people suffered silently, and they still do. But did you know that your wife had mental health issues for a while, or was it something that was like a surprise to you?
My wife was, on the surface, always very happy. She got caught up, and all of her close friends were, I don't want to say that they were necessarily needy, but they took a lot from her. And she always gave the impression that life was perfect. I mean, we had this, this textbook marriage. We had 2 kids. She was a school teacher. I had a successful career. At that time, we lived in a great house, and we had built a life in a community that's hard to do so. And so I think there was this appearance that she should be really happy. And I think for all of her friends and students and so on, she was really happy on the surface. About probably in like the fall of 2015, she had some pretty dark periods, and we got her into counseling, and she kind of figured out what her triggers were and that she needs to be okay asking for help. She was the more emotional one. I was the more stoic person in the relationship because at that point I thought that strength in a relationship was not showing emotion and just acting like you had everything figured out, even if you didn't really have a clue.
But that seems like you at all times. Like it seems
yeah, I guess.
No emotion, almost German.
Yeah, and so I think she was feeling that she was a drain on me because she was more emotional. She definitely did not feel like she was contributing to the partnership the way I was, and that was mostly rooted in a financial piece because she, knew that I was working a couple jobs and was bringing more money in. And I said, well, hey, that's not relevant because you're able to be home on the weekends with the kids and watch them, during spring break so I can travel, and you're here in the summer and you're an amazing mom. And, so I don't care what your occupation is. But it really bothered her that she felt like, I was doing all this heavy lifting and like, hey, maybe it would be nice if, you could be home a little more and not having to travel because I feel like you're having to work so hard between your job at the mountain and then actually going out and skiing. And then in 2016, we had this amazing Thanksgiving break to Costa Rica. It was the first trip that we'd taken together without kids. And that was a fantastic trip. I think we probably thought that was both kind of the highlight of our life, and then we came back and there was a lot of stuff going on. She was very close with her father, and he was getting dementia, and she had some health stuff going on, and it just kind of all bubbled up. And there was about 24 things where any one of them taken on their own wouldn't have been a big deal, but she was carrying all this incredible weight. And yeah, she just on Christmas Eve of 2016, she tapped out and took her life.
It was one of those things where I heard you were out skiing like a powder day. You come home to that. I mean, I don't want to talk about the details, but I guess I did. But is that correct?
Yeah, our family tradition was that we would get up in the morning and we would open presents, and then everybody had time to themselves from like 12 to 4 to do whatever they wanted to do. She would usually go for a run or do something active. That particular day, it was my wife, my daughter, and I, Christmas morning. We opened presents. And then it had snowed a lot overnight. And she said, hey, you should go skiing. I said, no, maybe I'm just going to hang out around the house. And she's like, oh my God, we hadn't had a very good start to the winter. And she's like, how many powder days are you going get that are like this. And so I just went out to Hesperus, which is about 10 minutes outside of Durango, and went out there and went skiing. It was dumping. It was probably snowing 2 inches an hour. And about 2:30 in the afternoon, there was this brilliant sunburst. Like the clouds parted and there was this like God's eye and this super intense sunlight. And I was just riding the chairlift by myself. I'm like, oh, wow, that was amazing. And I had left my phone in my car and I remember reaching for it. I'm like, oh, I've got to get a picture of this to send to Beth, my wife. And so clouds come back in, start snowing. I ski till like 4 o'clock. I come home and she is in the guest room. I assume she's taking a nap, so I go out and take the dog for a long walk, and then I come back in and I want to wake her up because I don't want her to sleep too long because she wouldn't be able to sleep that night. And went to wake her up and she was gone.
And I'm so sorry that that's part of your life, unfortunately.
Yeah. And she had sent me, when I got back to the car, this didn't all make sense at the time, but she had sent me a text at 2:30 in the afternoon, and all it said was, I love you. And that was her last text to me. 2:30 in the afternoon, and I had looked at my watch, and that was when the big God's Eye came out, was exactly at 2:30. So that was her light leaving, was what was the sun that I saw when I was skiing. So, and I didn't put that together until like the next day. But it was, my wife had taken the role of my dad and had truly become my best friend. We had an amazing relationship, she and I did, but, we'd had some challenges. She'd had some physical stuff going on. She was very active and she'd had a pretty big injury that had kind of laid her up for a year. And one of our kids had gotten himself into some trouble. And so we were kind of battling, some stuff. And so I think it was really hard for her to kind of feel like she could keep up with the Joneses and keep this happy face on all the time. So it was surely a shock because, it had been a full year before that we had gone through this process, where she'd had kind of a rough time and she'd done the counseling and said, I don't need to go to therapy anymore. I've got this. I know what my triggers are. I know how to avoid them. And things were going great. So, and we'd had that amazing vacation just a month before.
And then do you have to tell your kids?
Yes. My daughter had gone to her friend's house to watch a movie. And so the police had contacted her because she didn't have a cell phone where she worked. So I gave her the address of where she was. So the police went to get her and said, hey, have her come meet me at the hospital. They're going to take my wife. And so my daughter and I went out to the hospital here in Durango, and my wife was an organ donor, and they said, well, if we want to use her organs, we need to put her on life support, fly her to Grand Junction. And at the time, my son was in Grand Junction, so I said, well, I've got to tell my son in person. So I got in the car, drove to Grand Junction, met my son, my daughter and I had our time together at the hospital with her mom, my wife, and then I drove up the next day and told my son about it.
Oh man, well, I'm so sorry about that. And then for you, it's like the one outlet you have for everything in life is skiing, but like you take that away from yourself. You don't want to ski anymore. I mean, I get being depressed, upset. I can imagine all the different emotions. You couldn't ski. Like, why couldn't you ski?
My kids at the time were 14 and 16. My daughter especially was very, very close with my wife. And so I just kind of felt like I just needed to put my passion way on the back burner and just focus on, I now needed to replace a mom. And so I now needed to be a mom and a dad and just needed to be very, present for my kids. And I didn't at the time really, have an opportunity to process what was going on because kind of, flip the switch like, all right, I got to be the strong one for my kids and kind of get through this turbulence and be here and be the stable guiding force. And so I had told both of my kids, like, I'm done skiing. Like, I have no interest in doing it. It's something that, I have probably done because it brings me joy. And sure, it's been a bit of a livelihood, but I'm done. I can't continue to do this. And so this is, right around Christmas. And it was probably a couple weeks. I didn't honestly even think about skiing. My kids were like, you need to go skiing, go take a couple runs, go do something, get out of the house. You're a wreck. And it was finally a buddy of mine, Grady James, who's a photographer that lives here in town that I worked with. And he just called. He obviously knew what had gone on. And he said, hey, I remember back in December, you were telling me about this alpenglow shot you wanted to get after the ski area closed where you'd air off this catwalk. You'd be a silhouette up above the peaks. And he goes, I think, we should go do it tomorrow evening. I'm like, no, I'm not skiing. And he's like, I've already talked to your daughter and she thinks you need to go. So anyway, I went up and shot with Grady for a couple hours and I was super focused. It was a very tight window to nail this shot. where my form was tight and I was crossed up in the right spot in this little notch in the mountains. And we shot and we shot and we finally waited for the light to get this perfect and shot. And I remember getting in the car. I'm like, yeah, I got to go. I got to get back to my kids. And I remember driving home. I'm like, oh my God, for the last 2 hours, all I thought about was nailing the perfect shot. And so I realized that I came home and told my daughter, I'm like, thank you for making me go, because that was therapy. Better than sitting on anyone's couch and talking through it. I went out and I was just hyper focused on my craft and trying to get this shot. And so then I realized that for me, shooting was therapy. And all along, ever since I kind of turned pro and was trying to make it in the business, every day I was out skiing, I was trying to perfect my form for photos, not to be a better skier necessarily or to be a more fluid skier, but to be a more powerful skier and figuring out how to take all the energy that you create in the turn before the photo. I kind of truly, was spending all my time to make the perfect shots, whether it was like how to be tight in the air and have good form or to make the turn look as good as possible. And so every time I was out skiing or driving to a shoot or going out and looking at what time of the day the shoot needed to happen, I was hyper focused and I wasn't thinking about life.
Yeah, I mean, skiing is one of those things where, I mean, I would think that you would want to jump right back in to forget about everything. But then I realized, yeah, you're a single dad at this point with 2 kids that you got to be there for. So I can see letting skiing fall away. But then the kids actually say like, hey, Dad, the only thing that's going to make you better is what you love to do. So it's pretty cool that they were able to actually think about that for you at that time in your life. But how long did it take for you truly to become happy again?
Oh, it probably took me over a year. I think I finally got happy again. I got some things settled in my life and kind of figured out the pattern and how to navigate the roller coaster. And I realized after 6 months maybe that my healing was not going to be linear, that it was going to truly be peaks and valleys, and that I needed to kind of embrace my relationship. And when things were high, and there were those fleeting moments of true contentment, to really savor them, to kind of find the beauty in every day. And then when things were low, to remember that, tomorrow's another day. And then after just under a year, I met another amazing woman, ironically, same name as my wife, Beth. And she had 2 kids and she totally turned my life around. She, reminded me of how important I was and how my stability was important and kind of let me rebuild my worth. And so that, I would say that was probably when I got truly happy and realized I could be a good parent to my kids and be involved in another family, and helping them build something. And so I'd say probably about a year later, I got really happy and content and really started enjoying life again. I'd kind of been enjoying skiing for that year because of the fact that it created this separation from all the stuff that I was dealing with. But yeah, it was probably a full year before I could really, go to bed at night and say I'm happy with life.
Well, sorry to end the podcast with such a heavy topic, but I will bring up one other topic so it won't be so dark at the end. And I guess I'll go with, you've traveled the world like many times over, I would think. And when you think of just the dream trip that you've been on, it has to be the conditions, the people, and everything lining up. Like, what trip would that be?
For me, what my takeaways from a trip that make them truly epic, yes, snow conditions are important, but it's who I'm with, because after time, the trips kind of blend into each other, and my revisionist history probably makes the snow seem better in all the trips than it really was. My best trips, and there's probably been 4 or 5 of them, have been to Portillo, Chile. And those trips, the last 4 have been with Liam Duran, Amy Ingerbretson, Mattias Ostergren. And so going to Portillo, it's one of the most iconic places in the ski world. But the great thing about it is you're going skiing in August. So, you're riding your bike and you're in shorts and flip-flops one day, and then the next day, you land in Santiago at 6 a.m. and you're skiing by noon. So being with that group of people, some of my best friends, in one of my favorite places on earth, those trips are always epic. The last 2 trips to Portillo, the snow has been less than epic, but those trips in my mind aren't any less enjoyable than the first time Liam and I went there together when we had a couple feet of new snow and it went blue for a week. So for trips to Portillo, I mean, that is probably my singular place on the planet that I truly think is amazing.
And you named some hardworking people in there. You named Liam, you named Amy Ingebrigtsen. And I don't know if it came out enough in this podcast how hardworking you are, because how many covers have you had? Like, it's over 100, right?
Yeah, I think it's probably over 140 at this point, around the world, not just in the U.S.
And then it's like 2,500 plus different pages in magazines that are published. And that means that you're out there outworking everyone, shooting as much as you possibly can. But then you also have a full-time job. So it's like you're burning the candle from end to end. You're not going to the bar, although you can do that from time to time. You just don't have enough time in the day to do that. But 8-hour days working and skiing are normal for you. And what skier out there have you seen over the years that has a work ethic that almost rivals yours?
Well, Mattias Giraud, especially as a ski base jumper and just a base jumper in general, the guy is always 2 steps ahead of everybody. When he's in the middle of doing a project, he's already thinking 2 projects down the road. He's an incredible communicator. He's got the perfect blend of the optics of being crazy, being very articulate and having this great persona, and then also being a businessman. Even though his persona is crazy, he's actually extremely calculated. That's why he's been a ski base jumper for so long. But as far as adventure sports, I would say that he is surely in the upper echelon of hard work and taking talent and drive and harnessing them into creating a good niche for himself. The hardest working skier, hands down, is Madison Ostergren. She lives in Jackson Hole, but she reminds me of who I was when I was her age, and she's in her 20s. But go, 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 up climbing with a headlamp, sometimes not ever sleeping at all because she has so much energy, and doing the same shot over and over until it's perfect. The blend of doing stuff for herself and creating content that is true to herself because she's constantly pushing herself, but also she's just so driven. It's actually exhausting for me to be around her because it reminds me of what I used to be like, but her energy is contagious, and when I'm with her, I just want to go harder than ever.
All right, well, that is the body of the podcast, but at this point, it's time for inappropriate questions. And you suggested that I get Mattias Giraud to ask the questions for you. He's also known as Super Frenchie, and I've had him on the podcast. I used to sponsor him when I was at K2, and he's such a rad dude. And he loves to get inappropriate, and he sometimes gets really inappropriate, but these are tame for him. But I will still play them. Are you ready for question number 1 from Mattias?
All right, let's do it.
So my first question for Sven is, he's a really accomplished photographer actually in the ski industry. And I heard he did a few nudes. So which naked athlete did he take pictures of?
Well, the only naked athlete I've taken pictures of was Mattias. Not too long after our first session, when I was trying to teach him the tricks of the trade, I was saying that he needed a couple lifestyle images for his portfolio. And so I went inside to get my camera, and I came back out, and we were going to shoot some shots out on my back deck, and it's nighttime. So I get the flash and I get my headlamp to kind of make sure that I've got him on focus, and I take the headlamp out, turn it on, and here is Mattias in a pink thong. And I shoot a couple photos of that and think that that's very strange, but he could do whatever he wanted. And then the next time I light up the flash, here's Mattias in nothing but his birthday suit. What made that really awkward was my wife was coming home from a late night grading papers at school, and she walked out onto the porch, and here I am with a camera and a flash bulb and a young naked Frenchman.
Oh, that's so funny.
Yeah, I had to explain my way out of that. I'm not sure I did a very good job, but yes, so that is my only nude photography.
And given that he's French, does that mean that he had a sleeve, or was his sleeve trimmed?
I looked away as fast as possible. Once I realized what was going on, I had no need in seeing what his equipment was.
All right, fair enough. We'll leave it at that. We'll go to question number 2 from the Super Frenchie.
Okay, question number 2. I know Sven is a huge stoner, and he has a heavy pass of marijuana, and his first experience smoking marijuana ever was absolutely amazing. So I hope he can share it with us.
All right, I hear this is not true at all. What is he talking about?
Not true. I have a very big aversion to marijuana. The first time I ever had marijuana, I was in high school, and I had a friend that was in college, and I went to visit him down in Tucson. And I had no idea that you could put marijuana in food, but he told me he had made some pot brownies. I had no idea how marijuana worked, but I was really hungry because I hadn't eaten all day. So he made a batch of brownies, cut it into 8 brownies, and I had about 3 or 4 brownies. And about 2 hours later, all of a sudden, the world was spinning. I was crashing through a glass table, and I had about 3 days of hallucinations, outer body experience. And I vowed at that point that I was never going to imbibe in marijuana again. And I actually made it about 30 years before I tried it again. And I had not an equally bad experience, but I get anxious. And so marijuana and I don't mix well. So that first experience kind of set me straight from staying away from the green leaf, and I'm still doing it.
All right, we'll go with its final inappropriate question.
Final inappropriate questions. Oh, yes, I have it. So when I blew my knee back in the day, Sven offered me a special gift to help me through my recovery. And he brought it home, and my mom was actually there to be able to read the package. Can you give us a little more specifics on what your gift included, Sven?
Oh my God, I don't have any idea what my gift included.
You gave him a bunch of porno, some big box porno like Pinocchio, It's Not His Nose That Grows, and like Deuce Bigelow, Male Anal Gigolo, or something like that. I don't know, I just made that one up.
Oh, okay.
But then there was also a stack of nude magazines that you handed right to his mother. And I guess your sense of humor is very dry, so you just kind of like handed a stack of disgusting porn to his mom.
Yeah, so when Mattias blew his knee out, he was a young male that needed something to occupy his time. And I don't even know where it came from, but I had acquired a box, I think it was some VHS tapes of porn along with some porn magazines, and I delivered them to Mattias, and his mom happened to be visiting from France, and she opened up the box, and I do have a quite dry sense of humor. I consider myself witty at times, but maybe my jokes don't always go across correctly, and she was not impressed with the gifts that I brought for Mattias. But young guy in his 20s I got 6 weeks in a knee immobilizer. What else is he supposed to do? So I thought I was actually helping him out, but I don't think that I earned the respect of his mom at the time.
All right. Well, that is Inappropriate Questions, and that's our podcast. And we've been talking about doing this podcast for years. And you've been persistent, but not annoying, but just letting me know that, hey, you're ready whenever I was. And we're finally getting it done. And you made everything so easy. And I feel like that's how you roll. You make things easier for everyone around you all the time so everybody can get their shit done and you can get your shit done too. And it just so happens that a lot of the time it's the things that you're getting done are organizing people to take photos of yourself. And it's proven time and time again, like 2,500 photos later, that your formula works. And whether you're directing a shoot or you're planning a shoot or you're getting the beta on the shoot, you're making everything easier for everybody else. And that's why your career behind the desk and in front of the lens has been so productive, is because you're always working and making it easy for everybody else. So it's cool to hear your story. I thank you for telling it, and I thank you for your time.
All right, Mike, thanks for having me. I've always loved the podcast. And hopefully someone out there gets the idea to chase a dream, as silly as it may be, and they can too have a passionate life.
So that was time with Sven Brunso, and what an incredible human. The way that he takes control of situations and puts in the work ahead of time is what makes him so special. With anything in life, the preparation for a task can make or break you. And for Sven, it's getting all that beta and sharing it with everyone so the team can experience success. And then, when he's done, he totally shifts gears and goes to his desk. Well, I know how working that hard feels all the time because I do it every day. I can't imagine doing it by choice. But that's why Sven is such a beast. And I will say, talking to him on the podcast, while I did break down a little bit and I edited some of that stuff out, it really did make me feel good for a few minutes after we hung up. And I need all the feel-good minutes I can get. So thank you, Sven. And thank you to all of you for continuing to listen, for all of the messages that you send, and well wishes. They all really mean a lot. Finally, please review me wherever you listen and support my incredible sponsors. They are Elan Skis, Outdoor Research, Stanley, and Best Day Brewing. Have a great week, everyone.